Welcome to another episode of Learning for Truth and Love. As you might have noticed, I did skip a week and I have a very good explanation. So, amidst everything that's been happening, I think that things have happened that have been, I should say, I don't want to use the word forcing, but I guess forcing me to come to terms and bring home the work that I've been doing. And I suppose in some way it's almost like me being asked to reveal my hands, because some have been able to, by looking at my work, fully understand what it is I've been trying to reveal, and others, I know will require some of me being explicit. So I want to start by saying that I was doing a lot of thinking, mainly because of what was shared recently on social media, showing what was happening to a woman who was being put in a box. Anyway, this clip was shared. Of course, there's a part of me that wished it wasn't true, and hope for some reason it wasn't, but I realize it's really in keeping with the work that I'm doing and in the realities of what's been happening. But I wanted to respond to it because, for those of you who are not familiar, this woman was being practically buried alive because she was accused, this black woman, of stealing from, I'm assuming, a white man on a farm. And I wanted to respond to that mainly because a lot of it is in keeping with some of the work that I have been doing. I've been focusing on Black representation in the science curriculum. And I know you're going to want to ask, what does that have to do with that? A couple of things to note. We've been observing happening, events and things that many have been surprised by, and in some ways, events that a lot of my work have forecasted to me. Not in terms of the particulars, I don't think anyone can really predict the details, but one of the reasons, and I'm going to share a couple things. I know I've given some book talks on my book, Black Representation in the Science Curriculum: Implications for Identity, Culture, Belonging, and Curriculum Development. I want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to share a little bit about the book overview. I want to talk about belonging because I approach belonging a little differently. When I think about the African woman, I do think about belonging because it's come up in the research. I wanted to approach it differently by really addressing some of the patterns that I've observed. And so in each of these chapters, I do describe the methodology that I've used for unpacking some of these. And I think that one of the things that I've observed throughout even writing this book, um, I completed this book. I believe I had the full submission. I had to have it in by January. I think I finished it in 23. I think I finished it about the end of 23, but the book came out in August 24. But one of the things that I've observed throughout my research, and this is a culmination of years of work, is as a society, we make the mistake of assuming that if a few are wronged, and I'm not saying this is all society, don't, those who talk about research, and not just research, but seek, and advocate, an activist for social justice, understand that just because a few are wronged doesn't mean that all will not be. And I've observed that several have thought, and it's shown me in their thinking, that they believe that just because some were being wronged, they didn't really realize that this was character deep. In other words, if a few were wronged, people didn't really think that it would touch them. And it led me to, as I was looking through the patterns, this has been a recurring patterns through history, and I sought to capture things that were happening not only to Black people, but also to white people then. And so my book, I divided into 3 parts. The first is called Part 1, The Influence of Social Schemas on Belonging, Identity, and Meaningful Inclusion. In that first part, I focus on those patterns. And so I'm only going to emphasize and talk a little bit of what I talked about in the first part of the book. The second part, I focus on including the lived experiences and narratives of Black heritage in science as a way of knowing. And in the third part, I point specifically to science pedagogies and considerations for other ways of knowing. So let me talk to you about what this has to do with what's happening and what I viewed on that video clip in social media and why it was so disturbing. Social schemas. What are social schemas? I've quoted, I think it was Sakamoto and Love in so many of my research that I never, when I was trying to figure out what theories and what ideas would bring all my work together, I think it was only until I actually started writing that I actually thought of social schemas. Because it fell into place so nicely with the work I had done before on schema and schema theory. And so a lot of times we look at it, we're thinking of the individual. And so I wanted to look up social schemas, and unfortunately didn't find a lot of research that I should say directly pointed to it, even though many applied cognitive work do infer it. A lot of the work I found were, I think, mostly by people looking at English literature. And so they weren't as helpful to me because of the way they looked at it. So I decided to use the idea of a social scheme as a framework and infer. Unfortunately, it wasn't until after the book ended that I really found. I don't think I found it until after the book was published. And then, but it summed up completely what I worked on. So I am using that definition in my next publication. Anyway, back to what this has to do with what's happening now. Social schemas. Social schemas for belonging, social schemas for not belonging is what I have focused on in this particular section. The first chapter, as a matter of fact, is called Social Schemas, Identity, and Belonging. One of them I talk about how this relates to the idea of a schema theory and what was happening. And so, as always, even in my work, I used Bartlett's 1932, believe it or not, definition, because it's one of those theories that are so controversial. I guess that's why I was drawn to it, because it seemed like it would be a challenge to pull it all together. I guess I like a challenge, intellectual challenge. But when I think about what it means, even the idea of an individual schema captures what's going on in our society and social schemas and how it's passed down. Schema, I'm quoting, refers to an active organization of past reactions or of past experiences, which must always be supposed to be operating in any well adapted organic response. So the idea of, I'm going to skip over here. Determination by schemata is the most fundamental of all the ways in which we can be influenced by reactions and experiences which occurred sometime in the past. So I really wanted to capture some things in the past. One of the things that was evidence in the rhetoric that was happening, one of the things that motivated this was when Obama was president, I started hearing chatter from individuals, people I worked with, people I considered friends, and individuals. And the idea that I, who have been so protected from so much of the bad things that people have happening to, was hearing it. It was astonishing enough for me to wonder and think and assume, and I think rightfully so, that if I was hearing it from the most open people, what must be the chatter among those who are least open? Because these are people I consider kind, wonderful, very open people. And so it led me down the road of really pursuing the why. And so this whole chapter is about patterns I've observed in the culture. And one of the things I wanted to capture too in relating, um, thinking of my readership and wanting people to relate, one of the things I understood was even when we pursue issues related to social justice, there are, of course, injustices in the past and that we observe among and between white people as well. And so I captured some of those. I found an excerpt from the late 1600s. I'm not going to read about everything, but I talked about the importance of categorization, identity in social schemas, institution identity. Wow, I observed that play out tremendously, and a tug of war between often our individual and our institution identity. But in the second chapter, I focus on influence of social schemas and belonging, because I was looking at research and belonging and I wanted to capture it a little differently, because I wanted to capture also the historic, not just the historical concept, but STEM particularly. And so I also compared ideas about belonging between white and black scientists, because I wanted to juxtapose what the difference was. I think sometimes I did that because I know most things are more believable when they relate to us, okay? Thinking of all readership. So I juxtaposed those and compared the experiences of black and white scientists. As a matter of fact, I had collected this data years before I even entered academia. And these are thoughts I've been mulling over my head. When I view things automatically, it's almost as if I'm seeing patterns. I don't know, I can't explain it, but I just see patterns immediately. And they just all come together in the end. And so I had collected this data for, I think in this case, the ones I looked at was over, I think there were over 50 white scientists. But anyway, I wrote a methodology in here, specifically at the ones I pulled out from, I see, a sample of 52 biographies. This one was mostly white scientists. And for the black scientists, I had looked at a couple hundreds. Again, I haven't published this work yet, but I'm saying it because we all write from where we are. Okay, we can all come up with the same ideas and have completely different outcomes and results. So I looked at black scientists. I'm reading the titles of the section: motivation for looking at belonging, and I have a section talks about what belonging means for black people in STEM, and in contrast to patterns I saw in white scientists' biographies as well. But I wanted to highlight the part where I talk about, and I was able to capture some African scientists' excerpts looking at biographies, and these are archived biographies. In the methodology, you'll see where I draw them from if you're more interested. Even though I did a search for variants of the word belong, quote unquote, belong among the narratives, I was still surprised by how the word itself was used by these scientists. Belonging generally signal an affinity group for a group of or place. For example, Robert Winful, electrical engineer and former professor of materials research at Howard University, talks about belonging to the Fantis tribe in Ghana, as he describes that you belong to your mother's and not your father's clan, and that you inherit through your mother's clan. Alfred Mezzani, please forgive me if I'm butchering your name, is an internationally renowned theoretical physicist who is director for the Center for Theoretical Studies of Physical Systems at Clark Atlanta University. He describes his life growing up in a colonized South Africa. He describes how his family, quote, lived in as squatters in the language of South Africa, which means you stay on the white person's farm. You give the labor in return for staying there, unquote. However, later on, he went on to indicate that, quote, the land belongs to us, unquote. This was prefaced by discussing the hospitableness of Africans in giving land to each other, which they used and then moved from. However, he describes this in contrast to their relationship with white people. I quote, but the white man, when he came, they gave him land. He starts building fences. This is mine. And then the next thing you know, you find the land is gone because we are not used to having fences. The land belongs to us. So that's what happened. And then the next thing, the blacks didn't have any land left. Unquote. This narrative does shed light on a way of being that permeates the narratives in the United States, in keeping with white predispositions for belonging, which even today after colonization are associated with seizing and claiming land. He also went on to describe how belongingness was also assigned to people, and that, quote, just before the fall of apartheid, 87% of the land belonged to white and 13% to blacks, and that small percentage was barren. Skipped over. You couldn't grow anything there, so then you are sort of forced again into working for the white man on the farms or somewhere else. Unquote. There's a great deal, I'll keep it reading from page 34. I've been on page 34. There's a great deal of parallel between these narratives and what we see here in the United States. In his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? Dr. Martin Luther King describes the plight of black people immediately after. He indicates that the only jobs accessible to black people required women to work within the homes for white people. Black people were also not given the resources to form and create communities. One exception was Mitchellville, which was considered an experiment to see if black people could self-govern themselves. The town was a success, however. We can find many examples in history where black people's success garnered attention from developers or other financial rights holders who wanted to capitalize on the financial successes to ensure that black people would be consumers rather than entrepreneurs. Martin Luther King seemed wary of the excitement of the black populace, who were excited about the small victuals that came their way rather than seeing the big picture, because after slavery, jobs were more available for women than they were for men. Therefore, the United States paved the way for black women to be the main providers, working as the help in white people's homes while black men were without jobs. Other black STEM professionals also talked about the way the people they belonged to, or to a church, or belonging to an institution such as Hampton University, or to a sorority, or belonging in a family. Physicist and professor Sylvester James Gates Jr. noted that if belonging was not found in a quote nuclear family, there was nothing for a child to hold on to, and there's a sense of not belonging anywhere, unquote. He described this in relation to growing up as a military child. So anyway, I wanted to capture this. This is a short, I guess you can say it's one page front and back, 2 pages, 33, 34, part of 33, 34, part of 35. Because I felt as if it really shed light a little bit in taking a more comprehensive approach and understanding belonging, and historically, what that means, how we create belonging, because we do. We create and we control belonging, kind of like the way we can, depending on our own feelings and predisposition, we feel like we belong or feel like we don't. And so a lot of the work I've done, because I was looking at including lived experiences, narrative Black heritage, there was a lot of incidental learning on the way, and I captured, especially in part one, well, mainly in part one, I unpacked that and what that meant and what patterns that I felt I saw, especially related to social schemas and identity using multiple frameworks. I say that to say, and just to repeat what I said in the beginning, that many of us don't realize the nature of character that defines who we are, whether it's what comes out of our mouths, whether it's the decision making. And so, having observed that pattern and character for years, I wrote this book telling myself that I'll take forever to write this book. And the just interesting part is this wasn't really the book I was intending to write. Let me explain why. I intended to write a book. And I wouldn't say it's necessary, It's in some ways it will take more from me to research and unpack. And I told myself, even if I wrote that book, I know I'm not going to live 100 years. Even if I read this book, however long from now, we'll still need it. So I consider this book kind of on the way to that book, but it's a book that I was very meticulous about, really intertwining and interweaving not only the applied cognitive psychology implications, but also the applied cognitive implications, but also the, gosh, what is it I want to say? Looking at it from my field's perspective as well. But most of all, I wanted to create something that gave a different look at the same thing, that informed, that in some ways stand the test of time. Now, I'm going to end here by saying something that I know most of you will not want to hear. And bear with me when I say this, because many of us have been listening to things for years that we have not wanted to hear. And unfortunately, many of us did not heed what those things were. But we should be open to hearing what we don't want to hear. I spent a great deal of time. One of the things that helped me with this book and unpacking it was spending time hearing and listening to what didn't want to hear. Trust me when I say some of it was painful to hear. Okay, I can't tell you how many moments I had a lot of crying moments. I really did. But I told myself I was purposefully listening to this because in understanding where that person was coming from, I would see the patterns. And I still have data that I haven't fully analyzed because of that. I want to end with something and just to explain to you why I'm talking about this. And I talk about this because it's been bringing in my head and my mind. I always think about a part of the scripture that says, if you remain silent, even the rocks will cry out. And there are two different versions. I honestly don't know what this version is, but I kind of liked it better. So in Luke 19, 40 to 44, but he said, if they kept quiet, the stones would do it for them, shouting praise. When the city came into view, he wept over it. This is about Jesus. If you had only recognized this day and everything that was good for you, but now it's too late. In the days ahead, your enemies are going to bring up their heavy artillery and surround you, pressing in from every side. They'll smash you and your babies on the pavement. Not one stone will be left intact. All this because you didn't recognize and welcome God's personal visit. Okay, and so what does that mean? A personal visit. I liken this and I think about even a visit to love. Love always listens, always trusts, always perseveres, always embraces the truth. Okay. And when we reject that, it's character deep. It's character deep. It compounds. Each of us matter. Every individual character matter. Okay. I'm sure you guys heard, you can have one thing spoiling the broth, right? I don't even remember the saying anymore. Okay. or one bad apple spoils the whole bunch, or things like that. We infect each other. We can infect each other with positive things, or we can infect each other with negative things. So when one person is affected, it will affect the bunch in many ways. And we know it will affect, the effect is global. It's not just limited to one country. We've seen it over and over again. But when we want to tell ourselves a different form of the truth, and we don't often heed the reality when we're in that mode. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this episode, please follow for future episodes. I am really excited about the upcoming guests that I'm gonna have on this show, especially this summer. Some folks that I'll be scheduling and that we talked about meeting. So stay tuned for more learning for truth and love. Thank you.